If you'd driven through Palo Alto, Mountain View, and Cupertino in the 1960s, all you'd have seen were fruit trees. Fast forward just a few decades, and those orchards have been replaced by some of the most futuristic corporate campuses on Earth. Places that would go on to spawn the microchip, the personal computer, the browser, the smartphone, and AI. So how does a sleepy stretch of farmland become the most influential technology hub in modern history? The answer is stranger than the familiar garage bits would have us believe. Silicon Valley is built on a series of tensions and contradictions. In the beginning, this private sector paradise is actually fueled by taxpayer money. Then a generation of hippie outsiders arrives, talking about liberation and changing the world.
Oh, if I had to pick one of those two, I'm clearly a hippie.
Only for the region to become one of the world's greatest engines of wealth and corporate power. Today on 1440 Explorers, we're tackling how Silicon Valley was built.
So I love the story of how the name of Silicon Valley came about, and it takes us back to the early 1970s when it was a very different place.
Historian Margaret O'Mara is one of the great chroniclers of Silicon Valley. She's also a professor of history at the University of Washington. She takes us back to a moment before the place had a nickname, when a journalist named Don Hoffler is trying to describe this strange, fast-growing pocket of California to a trade paper.
It was still just referred to as the Santa Clara Valley of California. It was 40 miles south of San Francisco. It was still mostly apricot orchards and the like.
And yet, something new is taking shape out there. Hoffler starts hearing about it in local restaurants, in the language people use to describe the place.
They would just refer to it over their, one martini lunches as, we're coming out to Silicon Valley. This is Silicon Valley.
Silicon Valley. A phrase tossed off casually, almost jokingly, by this growing group of engineers and investors that seemed to be clustering around the valley.
And he needed a good headline. And so he's like, oh, I can say Silicon Valley, USA. That's a good way to put it. And it stuck. It really captured it well.
By the 1970s, the newly minted Silicon Valley was well on its way to making tech history. Beneath that rise and running quietly through Hoffler's columns were the two forces that had started it all: Stanford University and a man named Fred Terman.
The people who came to Palo Alto, irrespective when they came, always liked the town the way it was when they arrived.
It's easy to forget now, but the West Coast wasn't always the center of gravity. In the early days of computing and electronics, the real power was elsewhere.
But things like the computer industry or the business machine industry, all that's on the other side of the continent. Most of the action was still back east.
International Business Machines Corporation, IBM, was out east, and so was everything that mattered. The money, the firms, Harvard, MIT, Princeton.
The only thing that made it distinctive was this presence of Stanford University, which had a particularly wealthy university. It was up and coming. It was wealthy in land. It had about 8,000 acres of land that had been deeded to it when they founded the university.
The East Coast dominates American science and industry, while the West Coast had less going for it beyond one modest university and a great deal of land. And then, enter Fred Terman.
Well, Fred Terman is called the father of Silicon Valley for a reason.
Terman is a Stanford man. He grows up in the valley, studies there, and comes of age at a time when electrical engineering is starting to really matter.
The first year I taught only half-time. It wasn't an obvious course that I needed to teach, so I suggested that I teach a course in radio engineering.
With the outbreak of World War II, like so many scientists of his generation, he set out to fight. But not with a rifle.
America's scientists and engineers, most of them working in academia, kind of called up to work for the duration of the war, to work on these military-funded research projects. And a lot of them had to do with computing and computing communications and electrical engineering, advanced electronics.
Terman is pulled into that world. And of course, the world is still centered back east, where the money is, where the institutions are, where the federal government is pouring resources into science at a scale the country has never seen. But West Coast Sleepy Orchard Grove Terman is paying attention. He sees what wartime Washington is doing, and he has a thought.
He writes a letter to a colleague right after the war, and he's like, look, we at Stanford, if we really mobilize, we can be like Harvard.
Terman comes back to Stanford, as dean, then provost, and starts reshaping it around the future he thinks is coming. He builds engineering, physics, and applied science. And it works.
The university really turns itself into the ultimate Cold War university as a partner to the military and a partner to American defense contractors that are working with the military to build up America's high-tech base.
The government needs radar, guided missiles, communications, surveillance, the whole high-tech toolkit of the Cold War. And under Terman, Stanford is suddenly right there, producing the engineers to build it. But if building a talent pipeline is Terman's first big move, his next one is even bolder. A real estate play that may matter just as much as the brain power. Remember that land Stanford has been sitting on all this time? Thousands of acres that once looked like empty space? Terman and his allies realized it can be something else entirely. A place where private companies can set up shop right next to the university, on long-term leases, tap into its faculty, and stay close to the stream of federal money now flowing through campus.
And it worked. It worked. Not only did these homegrown companies that had been founded by Stanford graduates like Hewlett-Packard and Varian, but also some of the big electronics companies that were housed on the East Coast opened up these industrial research labs in the industrial park. And this is kind of the original university research park that was the model for hundreds, if not thousands, of research parks that universities have opened around the world since then.
It's a remarkably simple idea, but a radical one at the time. Instead of keeping the university sealed off from business, Terman knits the two together. Students move into companies. Companies stay close to campus. Research turns into products faster. Talent stops straining east, and that becomes part of the Valley's DNA. The boundaries between school and industry, and between lab and company, are porous from the very beginning. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the effects are visible. What the older Eastern institutions have in prestige, Stanford makes up for in flexibility. It has fewer traditions to protect, more land to use, and a leader willing to aim federal money, university resources, and regional ambition all in the same direction. And that is how a sleepy university in Orchard Country starts to become the spine of Silicon Valley. Okay, so that's the institutional story. But if you walked into the Valley in those early days, into the labs and the neatly manicured buildings going up near Stanford, what would you actually see people making? First, you wouldn't see one inventor alone in one room. By the 1950s, the Valley is already a cluster of electronics firms, defense companies, and young engineers, all working on overlapping pieces of the same technological puzzle. And that puzzle starts with a premise that sounds a little absurd. Every computer, at its most basic, runs on just two commands: yes or no, on or off, 1 or 0. As strange as that sounds, every photo, email, and spreadsheet, every complicated thing a computer does, gets built out of those tiny binary decisions. Millions of little ons or offs, all working together to create what you see on the screen. So the real challenge is this: how do you make a machine that can turn electricity on and off reliably, millions of times? That is the basic trick modern computing depends on. Very early machines could do this with vacuum tubes, but those were big, fragile, and hot. What engineers needed in the 1940s and 50s was something much smaller and sturdier: a tiny electrical switch, the transistor. First demonstrated at Bell Labs in 1947, back east, became that switch. But a switch like that needs the right kind of material. Professor O'Mara explains that ingenious material this way.
If we think about a piece of copper is a conductor of electricity, right? We have copper wires. That's how you get light. Wood blocks electricity, right? You put a wood block, it's not going to go through. There are materials that are somewhere in between. They can go on and off. Sometimes they can conduct electricity and sometimes they can't. And you can make it so that they sometimes are on, sometimes off. They are on-off switches.
That in-between category, that's not always on like copper and not always off like wood, is silicon. Silicon, which is a common element found in sand and rock, can be engineered so that electricity flows through it in some moments and stops in others. That makes it the perfect raw material for building transistors, tiny switches that can flip on and off at extraordinary speed. Put enough of those switches together, and you can do logic. And this is where the story moves west. One of the men behind the transistor, William Shockley, a Bell Labs physicist from New Jersey, is lured to the orchards of California.
Red Turman is like, come on, come on, come on. We've got lots going on at Stanford. You can hire fantastic young people to work in your company. Come on out. So Shockley Semiconductor is born, and that's the first semiconductor company, the chip company in Silicon Valley. And so that is how the silicon got into Silicon Valley.
Before long, Shockley and the companies that spin out of it figure out how to build a ton of transistors on a single thin slice of silicon called a wafer. A wafer is just a flat, round sheet of ultra-pure silicon. Over the years, engineers perfect the art of tattooing transistor patterns across ever smaller wafers. Each of these becomes a chip, and once they can do that reliably, you have the modern microchip. All right, so we have here the basic tools of all modern computing. The trick of packing enormous power into the smallest possible space. And if you knew nothing more about this story, you'd think this is the end. Except the funny thing is,
there is no commercial market for this. Nobody needs this, wants this. The Fortune 50 companies have their mainframes.
In the established computer world back east, the huge room-sized mainframe is the standard. Who cares if you can make them smaller, especially if you're charging a massive premium? Companies like IBM are printing money, making these massive business machines, and eating Silicon Valley's lunch. But this is where one of Silicon Valley's defining tensions comes into focus. The Valley loves the story of West Coast outsiders, of risk and private enterprise, far from the bureaucracies of Washington. But from the beginning, another force is running underneath that myth: public taxpayer money. Because in the early 1960s, the private market didn't need ultra-tiny chips, and almost no one thought about regular people owning a computer.
But you know who needs this? Federal agencies that need to send things up very, very, very high into the atmosphere, if not into space.
That's right, space. Specifically, the space race.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Suddenly, the US government has a very specific problem that ordinary consumers don't have. You cannot send a room-sized computer to the moon.
So the Apollo program, that becomes the biggest customer of silicon microchip companies in Silicon Valley, essentially the launch pad for the rocket ship, right? If you have one customer who wants to buy a bunch of your stuff, then you're able to scale up production. It drives down the cost per unit. Suddenly, it becomes a commodity product thanks to this infusion of cash.
The mainframe world back east is built around scarcity, a few giant machines sold at a premium. But the space race demands the opposite. It requires volume and reliability, because failure doesn't mean a bad sales quarter. It means astronauts not coming home. And once you can make chips in volume and drive the cost down, the technology stops belonging only to rockets. It starts becoming cheap enough and common enough to leave the lab and the corporate mainframe room. In other words, one of Silicon Valley's defining technologies becomes cheap, not because the market asked for it first, but because the government needed it urgently. The story of Silicon Valley is one of contradictions. In its first phase, the Valley is built by West Coasters who think of themselves as builders on the frontier, far from the East Coast establishment, even as they are squarely funded by it. Then comes phase 2, and that same tension intensifies. The generation that inherits the microchip comes of age in the Vietnam era and starts pushing the story in a new direction. These are young engineers walking around Stanford in the 60s, and they see things differently.
The computer is the thing that the military-industrial complex owns. It is owned by the big business, big universities, big government, and this is the Vietnam era. There was this subculture of people who were simultaneously being exposed to computing and saying, what if we took the computer and think about it as a tool for individual liberation? What if by putting a computer on your desk and making it a personal device, it can be a device for creative expression? What if connecting it by a network to another computer without a middleman, without a big university or big business or big government or the military? What if that is the tool for universal human understanding?
That thinking is what spawns the dream of the personal computer. It sounds philosophical, almost utopian, but it's based on something practical. The hardware has finally gotten small and cheap enough that a regular person might actually own one. And so in Silicon Valley, the idea stops being theoretical. It starts turning up in living rooms, garages, and a growing number of loose amateur computer clubs where hobbyists gather to swap parts and ideas.
The one around Stanford is called the Homebrew Computer Club. And what makes it especially famous is that in its second monthly meeting, the second time they got together in early 1975, two kids walk in because they'd heard about it from a friend of a friend, and their names are Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. Early 20s, college dropout, coming in pretty scruffy. And they come in with a pretty cool, beautifully designed thing that, encased in a wooden box, looks like it was made in shop class, but it encases this really beautifully designed motherboard, designed by Steve Wozniak, the technical genius of the pair. And that's the Apple I. They made 50 of them. And 1977, Apple has incorporated as a company. It is developing the Apple II, which it debuts in the spring of 1977, and it was a hit. And the Apple II was continued to be an enormous hit. It was encased in off-white plastic. It looked utterly different than any other computer in the market. It was marketed unlike any other personal computer in the market.
This is my Apple.
Apple, the most personal computer.
The Apple II isn't just a machine for specialists anymore. It's something anyone can have in their home. People start typing digitally instead of rewriting whole pages on a typewriter. Kids start seeing computers at school too, playing games in something called a computer class. And back at home, people are printing banners, saving recipes, and building little routines around this new machine. And the money follows. The Apple II is not a quirky club project anymore. It becomes a real business with a very real revenue. The countercultural kids are suddenly selling a consumer product at scale. They're raising capital, hiring, marketing, and learning how to act like the very corporations they once hated. And speaking of capital, by the 1970s, another key Silicon Valley character enters the scene, the venture capitalist. Their business is not lending money to safe companies, as normal banks do. Their business is trying to spot the future winners early, when they still look strange and unreliable and maybe even a little ridiculous. So instead of making a loan, they take a stake in that company. In other words, they bet that a company with no long track record and maybe no profit at all could still become huge. Venture capitalists help the startups build management teams and push for growth. And again, the tension is hard to miss. The legend is the lone founder in the garage, but the garage keeps opening onto a whole infrastructure of organized money. As always, the Valley's two instincts are moving together. On one side, the countercultural belief that technology can set people free. On the other side, the huge financial machinery needed to turn that belief into a business. And for a while in the 70s, it can feel like the Valley has won. Then, the titans of the East Coast come punching back. In 1981, IBM enters the personal computer market with the IBM PC.
A good time to learn about the IBM personal computer.
IBM is not a scrappy startup. Founded in 1911, it is a century-old giant that sells machines to governments, banks, and major corporations. And it makes its money by being the safe choice. As a result, the PC isn't the most elegant machine, but it carries credibility with corporate America. And IBM makes a choice that ends up shaping the whole decade. The IBM PC is built from common parts, so other companies can make computers that work basically the same way. Then there's its software, which some viewers may remember. The IBM PC runs on DOS, and DOS isn't exclusive to IBM. It could be licensed to other PC makers too. Put those two things together and you get something new. Lots of different brands, but one shared PC world. The same programs run across all of them, and that creates a huge uniform market for developers. And all these companies, Dell, Gateway, Compaq, spring up far from Silicon Valley. By 1984, IBM is making about $4 billion from the PC market alone. More than twice Apple's share with its own version, the Macintosh. And so, one of the most famous scenes in Silicon Valley's history unfolds.
So Apple is reorganizing. John Sculley on the left is taking control from Stephen Jobs on the right. Jobs is Apple's co-founder, who a few months ago was so high on the new Macintosh. Experts say it will also eliminate between 300 and 1,400 jobs.
The prototypical Silicon Valley outsider is out, and the Valley's most cherished story takes a hit right along with him. that the rebels will always outsmart and outpace the institutional power. By the early 1990s, Silicon Valley is no longer the clear center of personal computing. PCs are everywhere, in homes, in schools, in offices, but more and more, those machines are running Windows, an operating system made outside of the Valley. And so the dominant style of computing feels corporate and standardized. For a moment, the Valley looks like it may have lost its edge. The great rebel project of the 1970s, the dream of the personal computer as something creative, liberating, and human, seems to have been absorbed into the world of business machines. But as we've seen, Silicon Valley is often at its most consequential when it finds an established world that feels closed, clunky, or controlled by somebody else. By the early 1990s, that world is the internet, a network that efficiently links universities, government labs, and technical communities. But for ordinary people, it's still bewildering, super dense, fragmented, and hard to enter. And once again, Silicon Valley sees the same kind of opening it has seen before. Not to create the underlying system, but to translate it. Not to build the network from scratch, but to make it legible, navigable, something a normal person might actually want to use. This is a revolution. And Professor O'Mara has a good way of thinking about it.
It's like the retail storefront for the internet. It's the thing you walk in to, and you can type in an address and you can get where you need to go. There aren't a lot of intermediary steps.
This is the browser. And there's one that changes everything.
The browser that eventually becomes Netscape is developed by a bunch of students. One of those graduate students is a guy named Mark Andreessen, who at age 23 moves out to Silicon Valley. Within months, he and his graduate cohorts become part of the founding team of Netscape. And Netscape is the browser that is released in 1994, and it is the front door that gets the portal that brings millions of people online.
If millions of people are suddenly coming online, posting on message boards, uploading pixelated content, buying and selling on sites like eBay, you need a way to organize all of it. Not just comprehensively, but elegantly.
They released Google, and this was from the get-go kind of the cool kids search engine.
Google was created by two Stanford grads who first met during a school project. It didn't present itself as a company so much as a mission. This was Fred Terman's dream. Stanford as an engine for turning research into companies that reshape the world.
The interface, in contrast to all these cluttered, busy search engines, was totally white space, clean, beautifully designed, anti-commercial.
That aesthetic was part of a larger ethos. Google's early motto, "Don't be evil," perfectly captured the growing tech world vibe of the era. Better code, cleaner design, and easier access to information could actually make the world better. It was a new corporate expression of the age-old Silicon Valley idea that technology can empower individuals and loosen the grip of stuffier institutions.
The first few years, Google made no money because they had not figured out how to make money without putting lots of ads on things. Then they figured out how to embed the ads in the search results themselves, and off to the races.
And this becomes a recurring playbook in this most current iteration of the Silicon Valley story. The pitch begins in the language of openness. Organize the world's information, connect people, give users a voice, make the internet feel less corporate. And then, inevitably, comes the second act, the discovery that what you've really built is a machine for capturing human attention and money at planetary scale. By 2025, Google's search, with its own embedded ads, was bringing in about $54 billion in a single quarter. And the list keeps growing, because the contradiction keeps repeating. The explosion of social media is part of this story too. Take Facebook, the defining social media company of its era, started in a dorm room in 2004. It presented itself as a tool for connection and openness. Its mission was to make the world more open and connected. But as it grew, the same familiar pattern reappeared. Idealistic language on the surface, and underneath it, an enormously powerful business built on capturing attention at scale. By 2025, Facebook's parent company, Meta, reported just over $200 billion in annual revenue. And then today, take ChatGPT's creator, OpenAI. OpenAI was founded in 2015 as a nonprofit, explicitly organized around the idea that artificial intelligence should benefit all of humanity. Then, in 2019, it created a for-profit subsidiary to raise the extraordinary amounts of capital that advanced AI would require. If this sounds like the same old Silicon Valley story, Professor O'Mara says there's an important shift now.
The concentration of power and wealth is something that is novel and different. It's one reason that a lot of people feel differently about Silicon Valley than they did 10 or 15 years ago, when it was seen as a more benign, kinder, gentler sort of capitalism, right? There were a lot more hopes about what it would mean for, what their products would bring, make the world a better place. And now there's understandably more concern about what are these companies, where are they taking us, and where will this all go?
That question, where will this all go, landed differently for me once I could see the full arc of the story. It's a story about how the American West became the very power center it once defined itself against. A region that cast itself as the private sector capital of the world, was built on federal research money and government demand. And then there's the countercultural ethos of the 1960s and 70s, which is still there too, at least in myth. Jobs and Wozniak with shaggy hair at homebrew, passing around a homemade machine that seemed to promise personal freedom from the gray corporate world. But the company that grew out of that scene, Apple, is now one of the most valuable corporations on earth. What I kept coming back to, though, is that maybe this contradiction isn't incidental. Maybe it's the fuel. Silicon Valley has always drawn power from this weird mix: anti-establishment swagger paired with institutional discipline, suspicion of centralized power paired with a talent for accumulating it. That doesn't make the tension harmless, as Professor O'Mara notes, but it may help explain why this place has been so productive, and why it keeps remaking the world in its image. The same region that set out to escape the old centers of power became one of the most powerful centers of all.